So again, thanks for joining us. Here to talk about writing stable iOS applications is Leah Culver from Breaker. Please give her a warm welcome.
Hi, thanks so much, and good morning. Hope you're all doing well this morning. I know this AltConf can be a little bit of a marathon and not a sprint, so by Wednesday, I hope you're holding up. Thanks for coming to my talk. Writing stable iOS applications is just a very fancy title that they made me, I think the original title was like, Don't Crash. So this is a much nicer title than just Don't Crash, but basically we'll be talking about app crashes, which is one of my favorite topics. So a little bit about my background. Why am I talking about app crashes? I've been a developer professionally for 13 years. I know maybe that sounds pretty young to some of you. Sounds pretty old to me. And I'm actually a 3-time startup founder. So my current startup is Breaker. And it's an iOS app for listening to podcasts. And yeah, this is us in the App Store. Some nice pretty backgrounds. But some special things about Breaker for podcast listening is we help you find and follow friends. You can also share podcast episodes, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and Snapchat, send episodes to friends, all sorts of social things. Find new episodes based on what other people are listening to. So we do a lot of, I kind of think of us as like the next generation of podcast apps. We're not just like a personal to-do, note-taking kind of productivity app. We're more of like Instagram or YouTube for podcasts. And so one of the reasons I want to talk about crashes is we are one of the top podcast apps for iOS. We have quite a few users, lots of people using the app every day on all sorts of different types of devices or iOS devices. And actually, we're coming soon to Android. So this talk will be very focused around iOS, obviously, because we're here. But we're pretty excited about also having our Android app coming soon. So Breaker's about 2 years old. And it's all written in Swift, which was a pretty big gamble back then. I think we actually kind of started it the code base about 3 years ago. Swift was pretty young. And it's grown to be a sizable code base. It's not huge, but we have 35,000 some lines of code. I guess only 33 of them are Swift. Anyways, this is a fun tool if you ever want to see how many lines of code you have in a project. Count lines of code. All right. So let's get into it. So a little bit of history about Breaker. Now you kind of know where we're coming from. One of the things we care a lot about at Breaker is crashes. So I am very anti-crashing on users. Why do we care? Why do we care about crashes? It's a bad user experience is basically what it comes down to. It's jarring, it feels wrong, and it feels obviously broken. When an app crashes on you, it's a sign that something actually went really, really wrong. So what's the alternative to crashing? Well, sometimes there will be weird stuff that happens. And in our philosophy at Breaker, it's better that things just kind of don't work than that they just straight out crash. We actually have a tool in our app where users can report bugs to us, and oftentimes we'll get reports of bugs where something doesn't quite work. We also do lots of logging. And I'll get into this later. Like, what are the alternatives to crashing? I'll get into that later in the talk. All right, so I wanted to start off by talking about a few kinds of common crashes, and hopefully this will be useful. So maybe if you've been developing iOS apps for a long time, this might be old hat. But it's something I think about a lot, is catching these very common types. And by common types, I mean at Breaker, this is probably 90% of our crashes fall into these categories. So what are some things that can easily crash your app? Force unwrapping optionals. So you probably all have seen the exclamation point in Swift. This is also, I don't know if I mentioned, it's sort of a Swift-focused talk, so I apologize to any Objective-C people still out in the audience. Does anyone still write Objective-C? All right. So what's an example of force unwrapping an optional, right? So the URL constructor is something that could optionally return nil. And here's an example of force unwrapping this to make URL actually have a value. This is great. Like, this is a valid URL, right? This is a website. This is not a website. And actually, force unwrapping this optional will crash your app, right? So why would you ever do this? Like, you know that a URL is valid in your code. Why would this ever happen? Maybe someone refactored the code, so maybe something's declared earlier in the file and then somehow it gets changed and it's now invalid. You could be copying and pasting code from someplace else in your app. User entered values, so if you allow the user to enter a URL, maybe they enter an emoji. Or just in general, something weird can happen. You never really know. So I'm pretty against forced unwrapping optionals. What are the alternatives? Well, this one's pretty common, using an if-let. So just say, like, if the URL exists, then do something with it. If the URL doesn't exist, maybe you have some code to handle that case as well. Or if the URL is invalid, maybe you show an error message. That'd be good. My personal favorite, I actually love using these more than I like using the if-let syntax, is to set up guard statements. I usually set them up at the beginning of a function. And it allows you, it's the same type of thing, but allows you to validate that everything is good to go before sort of going on. So big fan. It just lets us know, like, OK, past this point, everything is fine, and you can just work with it as normal. And then the third option, of course, the Nil Coalescing Operator. Just being able to sort of say, if it's nil, do something else with it, but don't crash the app. I love using this for like constructing things with integers and giving some default values. So those are all three great options. We have actually a pretty strict policy at Breaker. We never force unwrap optionals. And you might say, like, well, it's good because you want to be able to catch, as a developer, catch when something is obviously wrong, but I disagree. I think having errors for developers is different than showing errors to users, right? So as an alternative, if you do, like in your if-let statement or in your guard statement, if something goes wrong, log an error. Like, that's fine, but don't show that to users. Or don't crash their app. And we're really hardcore. I mean, this is an interface builder outlet. These, by default, are force unwrapped, and we change them to be to allow for nil values. So what's really nice about this type of syntax is if title label is nil, this next line does nothing, which is great. And it's no more lines of code than how it would be typically written if it was force unwrapped. OK, so I could probably give a whole talk on just force unwrapping optionals, because that is by far the #1 cause of crashes that we see in sort of any app that I've worked on, including Breaker. But another super common one, probably #2, is array indexes being out of bounds. And this is something where Swift will just crash, right? So here I have an array of podcast titles, and I try and find something in an index that doesn't exist, just crashes, right? This is actually not great. I'm not a huge fan of this behavior. So at Breaker, we kind of do sort of a dirty fix, which is that we have these extensions that sort of check for safe values, and basically just checking if the object is in the collection or in the array. And then if so, return it, otherwise return nil. So instead of crashing, this now becomes an optional, right? So here's what it would look like to use that. Here's the list of titles. We're trying to access it. There's that safe method that we defined on collections. So we check title safe at index 2. And this will fail, but it'll just return. It won't crash the app, which is great. And it's not only sort of looking things up at an index. We actually have methods for removing things from an array or scrolling to a row in a table view that may or may not exist. These are really common cases where if that item in that array doesn't exist, your app will just crash under normal circumstances. So it's nice to have these like safe methods. And I'll put my slides up on speaker deck later and tweet it out. So if you like want to steal these methods, please go ahead. So those two are the most common things we see. We use Interface Builder at Breaker. We like to build things pretty quickly. We might be trying out Swift UI later, but for now, we do most of our sort of development, not necessarily in storyboards, but in Interface Builder files and nibs. And one thing we run into a lot is misconfigured Interface Builder outlets. And this is the crash you get, which is pretty gross. And then here's an example. This is probably the most common reason this happens, is you're just renaming things. So I changed here, you can see the outlet expects something called show label, and I've changed it to be more specific to show name label. But now my outlet is connected to something that doesn't really exist because I've changed the name. So a really easy way to avoid this in Xcode, which I love now, is they have this refactor function. So you can just right-click on a variable and say, I'm going to rename this. So I love it because it catches things in the outlets and lets you rename them as well. So you can see down at the bottom, it's like, oh, you have this attached to something with that name. Do you want to change that as well? So yes, I did want to change that. And this is actually pretty easy to catch. The way that we catch it at Breaker is we just run the app when we're building new views and test it out, and it will crash. And you can identify pretty easily like where this happened. So this was in this cell with this label. So pretty easy. And the final one, which I think is maybe the hardest one for me to catch at least, is UI being updated on a background thread. And one of the reasons this is one of the weirdest ones to catch is that, one, sometimes Apple runs things on a background thread and doesn't document it. So some of their things are, like, you take a guess, you're like, I think maybe this is running on a background thread. And the other difficult problem is this doesn't always crash, right? Like, it crashes sometimes, but often it just throws out a warning and doesn't actually crash your app, just nothing happens. So I'll show an example. This is like a UI element we pop up to ask if users want to turn on push notifications, get notified of new episodes from their favorite shows. And here's the code for that. I highlighted the line that works on the main thread or on the UI. And you can see we're using the UN user notification center, get notification settings. There's no indication that this runs on a background thread other than you might suspect it does. And then we check if they've said not to turn, and we pop up this notification. And this is the error we get. Actually, when I was running this to test it out, doesn't actually crash every time. But it'll give you this nice warning. UI API called on a background thread. And the fix is pretty easy. Just make sure that all UI work is done on the main thread. So those are the 4 types of common crashes that we run into at Breaker. And I think all of them are pretty easy to identify and fix. But I wanted to talk a little bit about sort of the tooling that we use to catch these types of errors. So how do we figure out when things are crashing, other than just running things on the simulator or on our device and looking at the logs? We actually use Crashlytics at Breaker, but we're looking for a new tool because obviously Crashlytics is migrating onto Firebase and things like that. But it's a great way to sort of get like a log of crashes. So I think the important thing here isn't exactly which tools you use, but being able to sort of know when users' apps are, or when the app is crashing for users, and then to get some sort of stack trace. And there are a bunch of tools. I'm actually meaning to check out, I think Bugsy is a sponsor here, so there's other things you can use to detect your crashes. But you know, when I was writing this talk, I thought, well, wouldn't it be fun to try and actually catch a crash that's happening in Breaker right now? So I identified one, not super frequent, but we were occasionally getting this crash, and here's the stack trace. And the line with the little arrow is the one we're looking for. So able to identify the line number and where it's crashing. Here's the code, here's the line. Does anyone spot what the error is, why it might be crashing? It's something I mentioned earlier. It's one of the 4 common crashes.
Scroll to row.
Yeah, so it's this scroll to row and index path. And the problem is, what if index path at row 0, section 0 doesn't exist? So say the table view is empty, right? That'll definitely crash. So easy replacement, saw this method earlier. In the examples, we have scroll to row safe was one of the methods that we sort of a custom thing we have to sort of handle this. So I just swapped it out, scroll to row safe. That'll do the check if the index path actually exists, and then it'll scroll to it. Otherwise, this does nothing, which is fine because the table's empty. There's nothing to scroll to. So that's an example of looking at a stack trace and using that for debugging. Another thing that we do at Breaker, in addition to just tracking crashes, is the other alternative. So if you're not going to crash the app, what we do want to know is we still want to know with these errors, right? So we still want to know if something is going wrong in a way that's not expected. So we use exception logging. So don't crash. Don't ruin the user's experience. Just log it for later for developers. So here's a class that we use for logging. We also use Crashlytics, but we've used Sentry in the past. There's other tools. But we have this nice wrapper that just says log event with a message, some info. And then we can track that down later. So here's an example of our exception logging in use. We're checking for, we have this method safe current time. Here's safe again. Be able to get the current time for the player without crashing or force unwrapping anything. And then we do what we need to do with that. Otherwise, we log, hey, we found something weird. Here's some info about it. We can go look at this later. So for developers, no crashing for users. And again, like I said, there's probably a lot of tools out there. I feel bad writing this talk and using Crashlytics, which maybe isn't even the best tool. But the important part is that we can log the stack traces when there is a crash for users, find out how many users it's crashing for, how bad is this bug. And then being able to do some kind of logging when we have an unexpected result. So I'm not advocating for hiding all crashes. The idea is to hide them from users and expose them to developers. If that's all you take away from this talk, that would be great. Like, hide the crashes from the users, expose them to developers. There you go. So we talked about common crashes, force unwrapping optionals, misconfigured interface builder outlets, array indexes being out of bounds. And then I talked a little bit about how we do crash and exception logging. So that's actually all I had. Very short talk today. Simple topic just on crashes. I encourage you to check out Breaker, the app. We're also hiring if anyone's interested in working on podcasts and doesn't mind never force unwrapping an optional again. I know, tricky. But yeah, so I'm open to taking questions since it's ended so early. Yeah.
Can you hold on? I'll bring the mic to you.
Oh yeah, great. Thank you so
Sorry.
much.
For a podcast or audio app, I see how it makes a lot of sense to never want to crash because you never want the audio to stop. But are there apps you've worked on in the past where crashing is the right move?
No. Sample code, that's it. Like when you get things out in front of users, like I have a pretty strict like don't crash it policy. Like when an app crashes on you and your phone, doesn't it feel weird? You're like, oh no, what happened? Something really, really bad happened. Yeah, so again, like I have very much the philosophy of don't crash for users, but expose those errors to developers. Use tools that email you when a crash happens. Use tools that will give you the full stack trace so you can track down the crash and figure out what is going wrong. But I don't think that should ever be on users to handle.
Is your Crashlytics crash rate 100%? Or no crash rate? Oh.
I wish. We're getting very close. I'm like counting the nines as we get down on every issue. But there's always weird stuff that happens on an operating system level that's very difficult to catch, right? So things like low memory, low battery, overheating. It's really nice. They just announced the Xcode. You can now debug with making it fake overheat. So some of this stuff is like kind of exciting, right? Because you can test things in modes where things fail. Devices, I find, I've been a web developer and a mobile developer, the crazy stuff that can happen on these devices means that it's really, really hard to get 100% no crash, especially when you have users on older devices in weird situations doing crazy stuff with their phones. So I wouldn't expect to have 100%, but getting closer to that is a good goal.
Okay, I have actually two questions. Can you go back about 3 or 4 slides to the one where you had your logger and you had the example usage? No, go forward.
This one?
Forward. Next one. Yeah, okay. In your else clause, logger dot, what is that?
Oh, it's like a book. So I want to give a talk on this sometime too. It's really fun. For singletons, we use emoji instead of using like default or shared.
Okay.
Because you see shared and default everywhere in like Apple's example code, and I'm like, that's kind of boring. Like, so I'll go back one more slide. There you can see it defined. There's our singleton
Excellent.
book.
Cool. Nice.
Styles is like, I think it's a little bow. The current user is a little smiley face. So they're all throughout that. So.
Very nice. Can you maybe make a few comments about using instruments?
What was it?
Can you maybe make a few comments about using instruments to help, not necessarily with debugging, but do you use instruments a lot for, maybe memory pressure issues or other problems within your app?
Yeah, so one of the nice things about using one of these like web-based tools is they'll give you some info about when something might be like a memory-based sort of error. So I think that's a pretty good time to take a look and run through those lines of that section of your app in instruments. I haven't found it to be as useful for catching crashes specifically, but it is one of the tools that you should be aware of for looking for sort of error conditions in the same way that setting weird stuff in the simulator and running through the app. Is that a good enough answer? I mean, crashes in terms of like when you're actually debugging in the app will actually like print out error messages and actually crash and point at the line number and stuff when you're running through the simulator. So I haven't found instruments to be particularly useful for crashes specifically.
I know one of the things you talked about was just running the app, running the simulator. So how does unit testing play into what you guys do at Breaker?
Yeah, we actually sadly are pretty low on unit tests. We have a lot of stuff for audio, but I feel a little bad. We're still like a very small startup, and we run pretty lean and fast. So a lot of the time when we're developing, we tend to sort of roll forward. So like fix errors quickly. We put out an iOS build every week almost, which is pretty fast. So yeah, we have some tests that we run, but again, I think most of what we do for crashes is sort of catching things at user time. So we actually run a test flight build as well. So we put things through test flight and test users, and so yeah.
Do you guys ever use OS log for logging instead of crashing? And how do you find it?
We've been using like the web-based tools like Crashlytics for logging. But
Okay.
yeah, I think there's many options. Like I said, like tools, I'm kind of like tools. There's so many different things you can use. And we're actually I'm actually thinking about switching what tools we're using. So.
Are there any other questions? All right.
Yeah, sorry this was such a short talk here, but I had one thing I wanted to say, which was crashes, and thanks so much
Can you please give her a hand?
for coming
Thank you.
today.